When an armor-piercing shell pierces the side of a Panther, the fuel ignites, and the cramped fighting compartment becomes a blazing chamber. The commander shouts to douse the flames, but fire cuts the way to the hatches. Smoke blinds them, and a few seconds decide the life of everyone inside. This is not a tale of a rare accident, but the harsh reality endured by hundreds of German tankers. Battle reports show that more than half of the Panthers lost were not destroyed by the enemy they burned themselves or were blown up by their own crews. Why did a fearsome machine become a death trap for its people? The answer lies in the rush and engineering compromises that put the Panther on the battlefield but had terrifying consequences. The tank was created as a response to the T-34, so designers increased armor and firepower while trying to keep speed. They had to build a powerful engine and a complex transmission, but reliability was sacrificed to ambition. Already, the first battles in summer 1943 exposed the weak points machines returned to repair, more often than to combat gearboxes, failed engines overheated. At Kursk, where 200 Panthers debuted, after 3 days fewer than 40 were operational because of breakdowns and fires. Where a T-34 could pivot on the spot, and escaped German crews had to pray that the final drives did not seize. Inside, it was as tight as a crowded lift, and the smell of burnt oil and petrol became familiar. Asbestos gloves hung on the walls to fight flames. The most terrible danger was not an enemy shell, but the fuel pump that forced petrol through pipes and often leaked into the engine bay. On a steep slope, fuel spilled onto the hot manifold, ignited, and instantly turned the tank into a pyre cruise, called these climbs fire steps. A British report based on tests of a captured Panther noted that during a cross-country run, the engine suddenly caught fire and the trails were stopped, and the machine was hard to manage because of overheating and cramped design. Even Guderian, the inspector of armoured troops, wrote that Panthers seemed to catch fire quickly and demanded an urgent solution for unreliable final drives. Officers noted that the machine chewed up running gear, and a French post-war study estimated that the final drive lasted only about 150 kilometres before the assembly failed. This meant crews could be left in the middle of a battlefield on an immobilised hulk and become easy targets. But even when the tank was sound inside, it contained a dangerous mix of propellant charges and narrow passages. Ammunition was supposed to lie in armoured bins, yet crews kept extra shells in the niches and on the floor to speed loading. And when a hit came, fragments broke them open, starting a fire. During a march on the Eastern Front, described in one armoured group report, a Panther caught fire in the engine compartment and burned to the ground. Another Panther also burst into flames, but the crew put it out. On that same leg, 5 machines were lost to hits that caused fire, and another 5 were blown up because they could not be recovered. By early February, out of 60 machines in that group, 38 were already out of action. Some went to factory repair, others were stripped for parts, and the rest were burned on orders. Any long march turned into a survival game because the engine bay could flare up without a single enemy shot. Reports from March of the same year note that 2 more tanks were destroyed by engine fires and 8 were blown up by their own crews, 6 of them because of serious breakdown. In the first 3 months, the battalion lost 60 Panthers, but only 17 were destroyed by the enemy. The rest were blown up by their own crews or burned because of faults. Does that surprise you? The truth is that the Panther's engineering complexity became its curse. Thin radiator and fan covers were vulnerable to shell fragments. Branches clogged the air intakes, and the engine overheated. When an enemy round hit the rounded gun mantlet, it did not always pierce the front armour but created a shot trap, deflecting downward into the thin roof. Fragments flew inside, killing the driver and radio operator, and red-hot metal pieces burned cables and set ammunition on fire. The side plates of the turret also had a dangerous trait. A high explosive hit could crack them, creating a heavy shower of secondary splinters that cut faces and hands. Even if the armour held the shock-spalled steel and paint spraying the compartment, leaving wounds and knocking crew out. Was there a chance to get out? In theory, early Panthers had a rear escape door in the turret and another hatch in the floor, but in battle, these exits rarely helped. The door could jam and the floor hatch was narrow and often blocked by the engine. In later versions, the rear door was closed, leaving only a periscope, so the way out was through the roof hatches. But if the tank burned flames and propellant gases boiled, lifting the heavy hatch and climbing out was nearly impossible. A sergeant from one crew recalled that after a hit to the engine compartment, he had only a few seconds. He felt the temperature rise, his hand burned on the lever, and when he tried to lift, the hatch flames burst into his face. He was helped by the driver, and they jumped straight into the snow, surviving by miracle. Not everyone was so lucky. In some cases, a round struck under the turret, blocking its rotation. The turret could jam with the gun sideways, and the commander gunner and loader were trapped with no way to turn and open the hatch, while the engine already boiled. The transmission connected to the engine sat at the front. Around it sat the driver and radio operator. When a direct hit or fire occurred, the transmission oil ignited, dousing the crew with burning jets. There was no room to move, and men died at their instruments. The fighting compartment layout placed shells in racks along the side saving space, but when the crew took extra rounds and stacked them under their feet, a single fragment triggered a cascade of explosions, igniting charge after charge. Instructions required keeping the vent ports open and shutting down the engine immediately if fuel leaked, yet at the front, commanders preferred to stay in motion. The high tempo of battles left little time for checks, and these mighty machines often went into attack with faulty pumps, like time bomb. Among tankers, there were jokes that they would be killed not by Shermans or T-34s, but by their own machine. Men hung icons and pictures of saints on the instrument panels, hoping to ward off the fiery trap in which they spent day after day. German designers tried to improve the situation. They replaced fuel pumps, reinforced the final drives, and changed the cooling system. Factories installed automatic extinguishers, but they often triggered too late or could not cope with temperatures of thousands of degrees. Some upgrades helped the road wheels become stronger, the fan covers thicker, yet engine life rarely exceeded 1,000 kilometers. Worn components failed and repair units could not bring machines to perfect condition. The war demanded sending them back. Why did Panthers continue to be produced despite the casualties? The answer is simple. German generals believed that heavy frontal armor and a powerful gun would make the tank invincible, and that technical problems could be solved as they went along. The tank industry was under pressure and officers urged crews to accept the situation. It was thought that even a broken Panther was more useful than an average enemy tank, and crews were ordered to fight to the last knowing the risk of burning. Yet statistics and merciless reports show that out of 60 Panthers lost in the early months of 1944, 37 were destroyed by their own crews, 4 burned because of engine fires, and only 19 were lost to enemy fire. Does that not make you think? Soldiers saw their friends die, not from a bullet, but from a glowing valve, saw holes in the armor filled with molten metal and smoke, and shouted on the radio, "The engine is on fire." Radio operators recorded last words, and regimental commanders noted another fire in their logs. Fear of sudden ignition made every enemy shot to the side a potential death blow. One day, a large explosive round hitting the side of the turret did not penetrate, but the shockwave slammed into the crew, causing concussion and making the instruments chatter like teeth in a jaw. Often a round hitting the side knocked out the cooling fan and the engine overheated instantly. Under heavy load, and heat oil began to boil, giving out thick smoke that enveloped the tank and demoralized the crew. In contrast to Soviet machines, which had several independent hatches, the Panther divided space so that the driver could only exit through his hatch and the commander and gunner through the roof. Any deformation turned these paths into traps. The situation was worsened because later models removed the rear turret hatch, replacing it with a narrow periscope. That reduced vulnerability from behind, but deprived the crew of another exit, lowering their chances in a critical moment. Before going to positions, crew members checked extinguishers, yet many knew that the automatic system would activate only when the fire was already out of control. They kept a bucket of sand or an old coat to smother flames, but opening the engine bay under fire was deadly. The thin, armoured floor did not save against shock waves when a heavy shell hit without penetration. The entire structure rang like a bell, and the crew lost orientation. The jolt threw men out of their seats, and sometimes concussion killed faster than a fragment. In summer 1944, one company manoeuvring between forest and fields met a hidden battery and took several direct hits. One shell struck the engine cover fuel, ignited, and fire burst through the ventilation grill. 3 died instantly, 2 survived, but were left with terrible burn. After that battle, mechanics found traces of fuel and torn tubes on the walls of the engine bay, which were the cause of the fire. The report dryly noted fuel line leakage, but behind this line was a human tragedy lived in seconds. In another story, a crew survived thanks to the calm of its commander. When the engine ignited, he ordered everyone to put on gloves and open the hatches, covered their faces with jackets, and led the men out, not letting panic consume them. This discipline saved their lives, and they thanked him even after the war. What did the driver feel when the floor caught fire under his feet? He saw tongues of flame through a gap, heard the crack of cartridges igniting, smelled burning metal, and realized that every second was an eternity. Compare this with the Tiger, which had no such serious fire problems there. The armour was thick, the engine reliable, and crews felt secure. But with the Panther, every part was a little lighter, a bit thinner, and the race for perfection proved fatal. Engineers knew about the problems, but resources were limited. War demanded quantity, not quality. So production lines kept stamping out tanks that went to the front and perished, leaving charred hulls behind. When the war ended, many Panthers stood in repair depots, battered more by wear than by battle. Mechanics stripped useful parts to revive other machines, and the hulls went for scrap. Today, the remains of these tanks can be seen at memorials, rusted with holes from shells and burnt interiors. Plaques nearby bear the names of crewmen who did not escape, reminding us that behind each machine stood people with fates. Why is it important to remember this? Because behind the statistics of breakdowns and fuel pumps are real stories of young men trapped in an iron box that betrayed them at the worst moment. Understanding these details helps us see war not only as a game of steel, but as a tragedy of human lives. The message about Panthers that burned themselves makes us reflect on the cost of technological race and how often technical daring turns into disaster for soldiers. The dark side of the Panthers story reminds us that even the most fearsome machines cannot protect people if they are built on compromises. It teaches that heroism sometimes lies not in victory, but in trying to survive when your own machine fails you. The final image is a crew that managed to get out looking at the burning tank that should have been their shield. In their eyes is relief and bitterness, and the flame reflects in tears, becoming a symbol of all the losses caused by this machine. And when we discuss armoured vehicles today, comparing armour thickness or gun calibre, we should remember those who sat inside, listened to the track rattle and waited for the next blow of fate to turn their life into a charred hull. This video is purely educational and documentary in nature. It contains no ideology or propaganda.